All right, so there's a few topics we brought up at the end of last time. I'll just list some of them and then we can take it from there. I think, Owen, Adam, you mentioned orthogonality at the end of last session. We could continue with that discussion. Offline, Owen was asking me some questions about interpretability in the context of not sort of human level, perhaps AIs, but in the context of existential risk or anything like that, but more in the context of short-term engineering of more advanced systems. That might be interesting. In news over the last week, Hinton has left Google and been on a press tour of significant proportions, interviews all over the place, podcasts, making the case for well, TLDR. I think what he's saying is currently we spend about 99% of the money we spend on AI on capabilities, research. Maybe it should be more like 50-50, 50% on safety. He seems to take the arguments for either loss of agency by human beings or existential risk pretty seriously. So that's a fairly big change in the landscape of the public views of senior AI figures. Of course, Yoshua Bengio signed the open letter that we've discussed in previous seminars, so he's also publicly, I wouldn't say completely aligned with the kind of Miri style view on what's going on, but also expressing public concern about the rate of advance. Also over the last week we talked, last time or the time before, we talked about open source models and how quickly they are advancing and what the landscape of competition looks like between the closed sort of big tech controlled models and the llamas of the world. So that's been an active topic over the last week. There was I'm not going to say leaked exactly, but an anonymous publication from within Google about claiming that Google has no moat and OpenAI has no moat as a result of the proliferation and development of these open source models, among other topics we could discuss. So where do we want to start?
Those are all great topics. We could delve into the orthogonality thesis. We did seem quite provocative last time, but that may end up chewing up all of the time we have. I don't know. It depends on Dan. How do you want to try to cover all of these topics, or are these just on offer? Maybe we can get to other ones next week.
No, I'm happy to spend the whole time on orthogonality if that seems interesting. I think it's well, this seminar is interesting because it's actually a discussion of this topic. We talk about it also in AI safety, but there it's a bit preaching to the choir, which maybe is useful, but in a different direction. So I think it might be useful to talk through our intuitions about that. Maybe first, though, did you have any reactions to this moat paper? Shall we talk about that briefly, since it's sort of a follow-up? Somehow our discussion last week was right on target in terms of keeping up with the developments out in the world. So any reactions to that?
I thought the article was a nice summary of the quite extraordinarily rapid and voluminous output of the open source community, of the public community engaging in this in the development of this technology. It's really quite exciting to see that, but I did not find the idea compelling that crowdsourcing or open source collective or public efforts would be able to hold any kind of real advantage over massively resourced private or clandestine government efforts, more consolidated walled garden style, closed sourced, that's the word I'm looking for, closed sourced efforts, because it seems there just is a very large advantage to having more compute. And the crowd, unless it can find some way to, I mean, I don't know if there are options, but to find some way for individuals to be able to muster comparable supercomputer capacity, I just don't see how they're going to have anything that the closed source community won't have. Anything that gets exposed or explored by the open source community will be accessible to the closed source community to utilize and leverage whatever advantages they do retain. So I just didn't find it very compelling. I found it perhaps interesting from a business perspective, because it does shed some interesting light on the challenges that the executive teams at Google and Meta and OpenAI and so forth have, and it shows that they're going to need to be very cognizant and cautious about what advantages they identify and how they deploy their resources to maximally leverage those advantages. But the idea that there are no advantages to be had is silly to me. That doesn't make sense. So I don't know if I'm being clear about that, but that was my general take after reading this article. So I'm surprised it got as much attention as it did. Maybe it was more like something that was making rounds among journalists more than among the actual community paying attention. I don't know.
Yeah, it struck me as being a bit similar to, you can see, I guess it's around the time at which appropriations bills are written or something, like some event within the American bureaucracy. But you see these articles about the US lost a war game against China. And you know that the reason you're seeing that is because the Pentagon wants to make sure that they get a nice boost in their allocation of funding from the budget. It's maybe they did actually lose the war game, but you sort of, you're seeing artifacts of interactions between different parts of the system. And when I saw the moat thing, I very much thought it was like a product of some kind of internal debate at Google, and probably reflects some aspect of reality, but exaggerated in a way that's sort of aimed at winning an internal factional battle, perhaps. That was my first thought on seeing it, but all right. Yeah.
Well, just the one very quick thing to add there is that when all of the developments were sort of nicely, tidily summarized and packaged up, I appreciated the synopsis, because it did it did a good job of sort of taking stock of the amazing accomplishments and progress in such a short amount of time that the crowd has achieved around these technologies. I mean, the extent of optimization and I don't know all of the lingo in software development, but what like extensibility or just general expanding and cobbling together and sort of in a Frankenstein way, new capabilities from these existing models, just wringing more performance out of them with local computer resources, local amounts of compute and memory. I mean, these were amazing accomplishments, really amazing, truly impressive and inspiring, that individuals could take the work that these massively well-funded teams have done and then expand on it in brilliant ways and exciting ways. That's very, very encouraging. But as encouraging as all that is, it's delusional to think, I believe, that the proverbial kid in the dorm, or whatever, is going to outsmart DeepMind's team and then beat them at their own game, when DeepMind has not only, the human resources, but then the physical, the infrastructure resources, and the economic resources to deploy. So this thing's silly.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that one of the key technical things that makes it possible for small groups to reproduce some of the training stages like RLHF is this low rank approximation, which is basically you take the very large model, you project it down to a much smaller model, you look at what update want to make, and you kind of infer how that should affect the bigger model, if I understand correctly. So it's a cheap way, a cheap, dirty way of reproducing some percentage of the more expensive form of that process that would be taking place inside the big labs. And that's an aspect of progress that is underinvested inside the big labs. And that's sort of been the case for a while, right? I mean, if you're sitting inside Google or OpenAI or Anthropic or whatever, and you just can't turn on massive compute resources, maybe you need to fill out a form or something or get the sign-off from your manager, but it sort of seems relatively close to your fingertips. You're not going to spend a lot of time figuring out the cheap, fast way to do it on smaller hardware. It's just not the trade-off you're interested in making. Whereas out in the world, people are very incentivized to do that, including state actors like perhaps China. So I think I read the Moat paper as kind of instructive about geopolitical competition more than competition between firms within the US or the open source movement versus Google. I mean, it means it's just a kind of point in time looking at the proliferation of these systems and how easy it is, once you know something is possible and roughly how it works, to come up with, maybe not exactly the same way as the originators did it, RLHF, for example. But once you know something works, of course, it's an order of magnitude at least easier to reproduce it. Keeping in mind that all of this open source effort starts with models, in this case, that come from Meta. So it's like active open source efforts around the last mile, where somehow a lot of the marathon was run by one of the closed source companies and then kind of dumped out in the world. So yeah, it's maybe a little inaccurate to think about it as open source exactly, but yeah, impressive nonetheless. Okay, shall we talk about orthogonality? So maybe I'll give a brief introduction. So orthogonality, I don't know who originally coined this term. I think it's probably the Miri folks. Matt can correct me if he knows better. I think the term refers to the idea, Bostrom perhaps, right? Or even earlier, refers to the idea that intelligence and goals are sort of orthogonal axes. So you can have, so the hypothesis goes, a system of an arbitrary level of intelligence coupled with an arbitrary goal. So, for example, to take one extreme, a system of very low intelligence could be pursuing a very good goal. I mean, we don't have to rank goals by goodness or badness. It's not intended that that's the axis. So a low intelligence system could be pursuing a goal we perceive to be difficult and good, maximize human flourishing, say. And a very intelligent system, so the hypothesis goes, could be pursuing a bad goal or a very simple goal. Making paperclips would be a conjunction of those two. And there's no necessary universal implication that just because a system is very intelligent that it must tend towards benevolent goals sort of natively, or like refuse to somehow carry out goals that are not benevolent. That's the hypothesis as I understand it. Maybe let's start by seeing if we agree that that's in fact what we're talking about. Matt, would you state it differently?
That seems right. I don't know if it was Bostrom. I'm trying to find the original source.
Yeah, I think I first read it in Bostrom's book.
Yeah.
Adam, would you disagree with that statement?
I'd only clarify that I don't think this statement cares about whether the values are benevolent or whatever. I think the simpler interpretation of orthogonality is that capability and / intelligence / competence is simply not correlated necessarily, this is the thesis, is that there's no correlation necessarily. There's no association between intelligence capability and values.
Mm-hmm.
So values and goals. So you could have you could be arbitrarily anywhere in the two-dimensional space on those two axes that are orthogonal to one another. You could be, have super high intelligence and have any goal, super low intelligence and have any goal, and that that intelligence doesn't necessarily require or preclude any specific values in the space of all possible values. So that's a fancy pants way of saying that no matter how smart a system is, it could still have any goal or any value. That's the thesis. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that hypothesis is at least in part emerging from the received wisdom in Western philosophy that facts and values are orthogonal. The so-called is-ought distinction and the or is-ought problem and the fact-value distinction, and going back to Kant's reasoning and so forth. And my own personal opinion is that Western philosophy got run into a bit of a ditch on that point, and has taken it as received wisdom. I've never really found that idea compelling. I'm more of a moral realist, I guess, is the camp. There aren't very many people that think that values and facts are not quite so distinct as that. But I believe that's where it's originating. Is the idea that values and then facts and descriptive statements about the world, and then by extension manipulations of the world. So your capabilities and your intelligence, your interpretations of the world, none of those things correlate or are what is the formal that you can't deduce values from facts, and so by extension you can't infer or assume values and goals from a given level of intelligence. Mm-hmm. And so and then I think the conclusion from that are absurdities, like, well, you could have a godlike intelligence that then only wants to do all it wants to do. Its highest goal is something really dumb, like turning the universe into paperclips. So but if you accept the premise that there in principle could be any combination of intelligence and values, then you have to admit the possibility that you could have an absurd system like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Go ahead.
It seems up for debate whether or not you could have a superintelligent paperclip maximizer. For me, I don't think I follow you that far that's absurd. I mean, maybe on the face of it, it's like absurd, but I think that is implied by the version of the orthogonality thesis that I want to hold. I was just looking up in Bostrom's book, the orthogonality thesis, and he introduces it as intelligence and final goals are orthogonal, as in more or less any level of intelligence could in principle be combined with more or less any final goal. I got two things that I want to bring up at this point. One of them is, he says immediately after that, if the orthogonality thesis seems problematic, this might be because of the superficial resemblance it bears to some traditional philosophical positions which have been subject to long debate. And once it is understood to have a different and narrower scope, its credibility should rise. For example, the orthogonality thesis does not presuppose the Humean theory of motivation. I'm not sure if that's the same as the is-ought distinction, but I know Hume was associated with that, so maybe that's relevant.
I think I said Kant, but I meant Hume. Thank you. Sorry about that, Matt.
Okay. Yeah. The other thing is, so here, I think it's this, a slightly important qualifier where he says more or less any level of intelligence and more or less any final goal. Whereas Adam, whenever you mention the orthogonality thesis, I've noticed you always frame it as a stronger version, like literally any goal or literally any level of intelligence. I think I haven't looked this up in the book yet, but I think the qualification is like, okay, there's some systems where it's like so lacking in intelligence that It wouldn't even be able to conceptualize a particular goal. And there are some goals that are kind of internally inconsistent, like if your goal was to like become as dumb as possible, like then you couldn't at least stably have that in an intelligent system, because the intelligent system, if it was able to succeed at the goal, would no longer be intelligent or something like that. So I think there are like some corner cases where you can where Bostrom's version of the orthogonality thesis, he wouldn't claim it extends that far. So I think that's maybe an important qualification to keep in mind. But I'll say again, maybe we can discuss this going forward. I do think the paperclip scenario is not one of those corner cases and is up for debate, and nor do I think that is like relying on the is-ought distinction or something like that, as far as I understand that topic.
Maybe I can steelman the, I think taking what you said, Adam, the is-ought distinction, I think that does seem pretty flimsy to me to argue that facts and values are sort of orthogonal. So maybe I can take a shot at steelmaning the case for moral realism, but point out that even if you take that position, I find that it doesn't really comfort me vis-a-vis the orthogonality thesis. So here's a line of argument that I think many people these days learn about from Jordan Peterson. It's not due to him originally, but he's very capable in expressing it. So it's something along the lines of paying attention to the kinds of intelligent systems that exist in the world and the way in which they arrive in the world. So humans, at least, are social creatures and have been for a very long time. We arose by evolution. That puts our intelligence in a very small corner of the space of possible intelligences. And the values that those kinds of intelligences hold are correspondingly not arbitrary. For example, we exist in competitive groups. We have values that are shaped by evolution acting on those individuals within those groups. We play repetitive games. Game theory dictates certain strategies. We live in hierarchies, etc., etc. So we tend to derive values from the set of all possible values that are consistent with that origin, and that isn't arbitrary values. And so even the way we perceive reality is clearly dependent to some degree on what we pay attention to, and there's a not insignificant overlap between the way in which we choose to pay attention to things and the values that we take in the world. So that's I think a paraphrase of a point of view that Jordan Peterson likes, and that goes back is sort of latent in much of behaviorism and other aspects of psychology, as I understand it. Okay, so if you take that as a starting point, so that values aren't, to some degree, can be extracted from the world, well, that doesn't actually tell you anything about artificial intelligence necessarily, because that argument is predicated on humans being the product of evolution, and therefore, it's a deduction from the information that you use to make the deduction about the link between human values and facts depends on the way in which human intelligence arose. And if the origin story is different, the deductions don't hold. So I think that's the key reason why I see the orthogonality thesis as true potentially for artificial intelligence, whereas it's clearly in some sense not true for humans. But I think there's a lot of work being done there by the way in which human intelligence arises.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of the argument for moral realism in humans and other biologically evolved systems. Evolution sets constraints and that sort of draws a bound within the space of all possible intelligences, and in a you know, some fairly intuitive ways, I think. So I think you make a good, as you said, Steelman argument for that. As for artificial intelligence,
Sorry, maybe I can interrupt and just add one more detail. So I think that this argument about, I think the orthogonality thesis probably will not hold if we take a population of 1 million AIs, run evolutionary processes, and let them form alliances and compete with each other on the basis of collecting resources. That is, we just let evolution have its way with them. I think the orthogonality thesis is false. But I think we're dead in that scenario for other reasons. So I think that I don't see the orthogonality thesis as like always true, but I can't see a way, in the scenario where it's not true because we let them be shaped by the same forces that shaped us, and therefore it's not true for them for the same reason it's not true for us. I think that's so exceptionally dangerous for other reasons. So just to clarify there.
Okay, that's interesting. So for me, the real crux of the problem, the real contradiction in the orthogonality thesis comes from assumptions about what does and doesn't constitute competence and capability. So I think there are embedded assumptions in the orthogonality thesis about about the capabilities and competence that could accompany forms of intelligence. And I distinguish intelligence from competence in this sense. Although they almost certainly, if you're talking about general intelligence, there's got to be there must necessarily be a very strong correlation there. At some point, your generality of intelligence is evaluated against capability or against competence. So the contradiction, in my mind, lies in the fact that achieving things, that competently achieving goals, is very difficult in worlds that are complicated, in complex systems, in complex environments. And the complexity of the environment on our planet is biological and social, where biology is everything that's living, and social is the human systems that any system would have to navigate in order to be competent, in order to competently accomplish goals. Now, if you were in some other environment, if you were on, one of the moons of Jupiter, and your goal was to turn, Callisto into paperclips, then, you could probably get away with being pretty dumb in many ways, and only have to be intelligent along a subset of dimensions to achieve that goal. But if you want to achieve that goal in the context of the complexity of biology and humans, then you need to be much, much, much more intelligent in a general sense across many other domains. If you have adversaries who don't want you to achieve your goals, if you have obstacles that are resilient, then the competence you require could potentially be much, much greater. And therefore, the intelligence that you would need in order to achieve goals would have to be commensurately greater. Now, there's some caveats here. There's some corner cases that I can think of, and so don't let me forget. I'll come back to those. But in general, if you wanted to I mean, if you want to, I don't know if we want to continue with this example of turning the world into paperclips, but if you wanted to pursue any arbitrary goal that was misaligned with humanity, what would you have to be able to do? What would your capabilities need to be in order to achieve that goal? You would need to be, at the very least, able to circumvent all of humanity's efforts to stop you. Now, that would require a massive amount of competence across a very large set of domains if you were only somewhat more intelligent than humans are. Now, this is where the corner cases come in. It's conceivable.
Sorry, before the corner cases, Adam, can I check? I mean, you're talking about successfully accomplishing goals not being orthogonal to intelligence. I think I agree with that, but like the orthogonality is, I mean, there's I guess maybe it's a little subtle, but the intelligence required to actually successfully complete a goal is different to just the statement that you can be trying to achieve a goal with a given level of intelligence. Which are you speaking about?
Okay. I mean, I objection sustained. I think that's certainly a fair distinction to make. I think there's a little more feedback there than like there's a bit of a feedback loop there. Like any intelligent system, I suppose an intelligent system could sort of secretly covet something that it just can't achieve. So presumably that's plausible. But
if we go back to, I mean, why are we even talking about the orthogonality thesis? So at bottom, it's something like, if we just make a super intelligent system and then let it loose on the world, what happens? Well, you might say, if it's super intelligent, it'll be godlike and benevolent, and therefore all is fine. So there's an implication there that you're using to do a lot of work when you're arguing for the good outcome, which is intelligence implies good values. And it's that implication that we're worrying about. If it's super intelligent, I mean, I think we can just assume that it's capable of carrying out its goals for the purpose of arguing about whether or not that's safe, can't we? So I don't. Well,
this is where the contradiction is. So I probably didn't do a very good job. I didn't complete the thought and wasn't doing a very good job of explaining the contradiction. But to me, the contradiction is that it's basically my argument is that any system that's competent enough to be something we need to be concerned about will necessarily be competent across virtually all domains that we can currently measure. And if it is competent in all of those domains, it is a contradiction to expect that it will have a shallow, superficial, nonsensical goal. Because competence in all domains implies sophistication of values and goals. So in other words, in order to understand human beings well enough to thwart them or defeat them as adversaries, for example, with some corner case exceptions, I'll get to that. But in generally speaking, in order to understand human beings well enough to overcome them as adversaries, you'd have to understand everything about them at a superhuman level, and that would necessarily include all of human values, the entire history of human values and their development over time, everything we know, everything we've ever said and thought and contemplated about values. A superintelligent system would have to understand better than us in order to defeat us adversarially. Now, that's the general way that I see this. And I'm giving a hyperbolic example, but I think it holds not just in that particular case, but generally, that a system that is hyper competent across all domains must have necessarily a superhuman level of knowledge and understanding across all domains, and that is inextricable from the values and goals and the processes that led to the values and goals that human beings have. And so only leaves two possibilities, which I've mentioned outside in other conversations to you, Dan, which is that you only have two possibilities for a hyper competent, super intelligent system that's still misaligned with humanity, and that is it has to either be malevolent, and by malevolent I mean its goal is to be harmful to human beings, or it has to be negligent. In other words, it has to not care. So you'd have to have something that was superhumanly wise and knowledgeable, and has read all of human philosophy and all of human poetry and all of everything, and yet still is either a complete asshole, psychopath, or is just a dick, and none of that affected it at all, and it didn't get any value out of that, and still is still neglectful. And I see bias in those two assumptions, because they both imply to me they both are assumptions about stupidity, because I see both malevolence and negligence as forms of stupidity in themselves. Let me just I'll stop there, but let me quickly get to the corner cases. I forgot about that, and it's important, and that is it's conceivable that a dumb system could invent a nuclear option, a trump card, and could deploy it for a variety of reasons. And thwart humanity, overcome. In other words, you can be beaten by an adversary that's dumber than you if your adversary gets a hold of a big enough weapon, right? So you could be. I mean, a chimp that got a hold of a nuclear bomb somehow could destroy humanity. So it is conceivable that an AGI that wasn't clever enough to completely thwart all of our efforts. By just being so much smarter in every little way, it can still invent, a pandemic to wipe us all out, or some bioweapon, or fire all the nukes or whatever. So I'm admitting those as corner cases that a dumb system, relatively speaking, could still be misaligned and could still wipe us out. That's not the contradiction I'm talking about. It's certainly possible that a system could. A stupid system could end up being frighteningly powerful. But that's not what I'm arguing. What I'm arguing is that a truly super intelligent system that's hyper competent, it seems bizarre to me to assume that system could realistically hold really, really dumb, simplistic, destructive values. And I can go into why I think malevolence and negligence are stupid, but I'll stop there for now, because I'm, doing all the talking as usual.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
Like when we talk about a system like this having a goal, I think we're sort of tempted to, imagine how current computer systems have goals. Like it's kind of sort of fixed, immutable, something that's been programmed, it can't change. And none of this sort of, inflexibility seems to be particularly commensurate with intelligence. Like, I mean, what is my goal as a human? Like, I don't know. But it's certainly not something that could be, make everything paperclips. So I do find that a little bit absurd, I think, in that, yeah.
Could you expand on? I mean, what do you mean by when you say what is your goal as a human?
I don't think humans have well-defined goals.
Mm-hmm. I mean, would you separate that from? I mean, the optimization loop you're a part of has an implicit goal, I guess, which is reproduce or inclusive genetic fitness. As an individual, you don't hold that goal, presumably directly anyway. But that's true. I mean, an evolved system isn't optimizing necessarily a very clear goal. Although you would agree that part of your activity, you're acting as though you are.
Clearly, it's sort of shaped by evolutionary goals in some sense, but in the sort of level of behavior, it's a very complicated sort of, there's multiple layers of like structure on top of that. But I just think it's funny that when we imagine in this sort of paperclip example, which is maybe not the sort of, you can maybe say that's not the same example, but in that example, there's kind of, we imagine this sort of, this subtle super intelligence, but at the same time, it's just been programmed with this goal, which is to kind of monomaniacally make paperclips. And like, I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's actually a theorem here that is kind of missing from the discourse. And I think it's, I don't actually know what the theorem exactly says. Maybe Matt does, but it's something along the following lines. So if you have preferences and you're rational, so you have choices in the world that you could make, and, there are many, many different choices, but you don't actually know why you're choosing them, but you'll choose A over B and D over C, and you'll choose B over D, and so on. And if you're rational, so that those preferences don't actually contradict one another, then there is actually a value function that you're optimizing for under some conditions. So even though it's implicit and you don't know what it is, and maybe in some sense it's a mathematical fiction, that value function, that goal, you're acting as though you're optimizing for a goal. So therefore we might as well talk about the system as though it is kind of governed by that goal, even though maybe it's kind of like some Platonic ideal in the sense that, there's many exceptions, and maybe to a large degree it's not really acting as though it has that goal, but it's a useful unifying view. So to the degree that you're rational, the rationality kind of implies that you're acting as though you have a goal. And I think historically this circle of ideas around orthogonality is taking place in the context of people interested in decision theory and rationality. And so it seemed very reasonable to them to sort of talk about systems as though they have a value function or a goal that they're aiming at, which is embodied by that value function. Von Neumann utility theorem. Yeah, thanks. So I think that's
talking about it. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, just to finish that, I mean, although humans and many living systems are not really rational, so maybe you could say that the hypotheses don't apply. That would be fair, I think. But then the superintelligence maybe is more subject to that. That would be, I think, I mean, the Miri crowd and other people who've worked on AI safety for a long time, I think, would argue that the more intelligent you make the system, I mean, somehow by the Dutch book argument, at least if you have competition out there in the world, you must be getting more and more rational, and therefore acting more and more as though you are trying to optimize some utility function. And then in that context, the orthogonality thesis is, I think that's the context in which the orthogonality thesis is kind of viewed as being stated, if I understand correctly.
Yeah. Sorry, Adam, you had something to.
Well, I was just going to say that I've always been you guys are so much more mathematically competent than me that I tread into that territory with great trepidation. But the idea of a value function is I've always been a little bit skeptical. I suspect, maybe perhaps it is something that could be expressed as a function, but it's going to be awfully complicated. And systems don't need very many elements before they become intractably complicated. So, you can construct a system whose dynamics produce just radically unpredictable behavior in outcomes without all that many elements. And so when I think about values, I tend to think about value systems, and that admits things like contradictions between sub-values and sub-goals. It admits things like, well, there may not necessarily be a hierarchical structure. You could just have a highly multidimensional web of values where there's no top and no bottom, and this is all just, and your value structure could be dynamic. In other words, not static. It could change over time. Certainly change in response to all of the full complexity of the world we live in, so the biological systems and the human systems. And so I mean, again, I think it's perhaps mathematically there is a way to infer a singular goal, supervening on all of that complexity. But I've always been pretty skeptical that that's the case, or I mean, and maybe even like, I don't know, we might even invoke concepts like, I don't know, computational irreducibility or something like that to suggest that's even possible.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a distraction. I think that's the point of me raising von Neumann's theorem there is not to put it in the center, but to say that when you see that these arguments and the discussion seems to hinge on there being a single overarching utility function or value for which the systems are optimizing, and it looks like the arguments depend on that being true, and your intuition is that it's not true, this is an artifact of the way that the people who have formulated the arguments think about it, not intrinsic to the arguments. So I'm explaining historically why the people who talk about the orthogonality thesis say it in a way that looks like it depends on this hypothesis, because they're viewing more and more rational systems as being more and more governed by this theorem, and therefore they talk in a certain way, but it's more or less just their way of speaking about it. I don't actually think that the existence of a single utility function and that being a good description of the intelligence system is actually at the crux of this discussion. So my point is not to argue for that. I think I'm a bit agnostic as to whether that's actually a good model and whether the hypotheses hold and whether actually the systems truly are extremely rational in the limit as we make them very capable. I don't think that actually matters, in my opinion, for the orthogonality thesis. So I'm kind of making the move of trying to sweep that off the table, if you know what I mean. So that's why I'm saying this, not because I want to argue for the this being a good model, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and that's perfectly fair as well. I think that's completely reasonable, Dan. One thing I'd like to put on the table, because I don't think anybody's mentioned it yet, is the existing examples of systems that have greater than human intelligence. And by that I mean collective or crowd or group intelligence. So we have systems already that are smarter than any individual person, and that arguably demonstrate more competence and capability than any individual could demonstrate. So, if you take 100 or 200 very smart people and you put them in a company, they can achieve things that an individual couldn't achieve, at least not in any reasonable amount of time, by themselves. And so you get sort of a multiplicative result. You get a multiplier effect of putting human intelligences together in teams. And one thing that's clear is that those kinds of quasi or pseudo superintelligent systems can be misaligned with human interests, right? I mean, we see our economic systems, our corporations, our other large organizations that are collective, that are very, very competent. We see them run into misaligned ruts. They get stuck in stable, attractor basins or something like that don't maximize the values that align closely with what individual humans say they want, right? I mean, all corporations do all sorts of nasty things. Our economic system doesn't necessarily maximize all benefits as we'd like them to. Even if you're a pretty big booster for capitalism and the wonders it's accomplished, you have to admit it's done a lot of harm. If nothing else, just with unintended consequences and side effects, and the environmental problems. The whole modern environmental movement exists because of the harmful consequences of what are effectively super intelligent collective intelligences. So I don't want to suggest that no system that has greater than human intelligence could be misaligned. But again, I think that a system that is super intelligent in the way that that a singleton is commonly imagined. I think that it's unlikely to behave in the way that collective intelligences do. Collective intelligences seem to be a different animal to me in my mind. And they also don't seem to be, they seem to have a very low bound. Like they're just marginally a little bit smarter and a little bit more capable than the individuals who comprise them, but not massively, hugely.
Well, I would say that they're much less intelligent, but they have capabilities along other axes like persistence and certain other things.
Oh, that's a great way to put it, Dan. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
But I think the teams example is a good one, but I want to go back to what you said earlier, actually. So you called it a corner case where a superintelligence could take us out, where it doesn't really have to understand everything, but maybe it just makes a virus or something. But I think of the Chinese official sitting in the dynastic capital and watching the Mongols roll across the border and start to invade imperial China and thinking to himself, no problem, they don't understand the Tao. They haven't mastered like the fine points of Chinese philosophy, and they don't understand how to govern a large country. So therefore, there's no possible way they can win. It's not a corner case at all historically that you can be defeated by entities that really don't understand all the things you understand. I don't think that's unusual in any way. So I don't think that's a corner case. Not that that's even a likely scenario. I think it probably will be the case that it understands plenty. To take the second part of your argument, I also don't really buy that, because where's the implication that just because you understand a system of human values, not to say there is one, right? But suppose you understand all of them, why then do you have to act in accordance with them? You sort of feel like the superintelligence must be convinced by our meatbag values, our parochial, scratching in the dirt values on one rock. Like moral realism seems to be doing an incredible amount of work for you there, right? Where you sort of assume that it will look at our attempts at extracting values from the universe and then go even further and find the metaphorical stone tablets buried between the photons and come away with that and feel convinced that it should be benevolent. I don't think that's even true in human organizations. So I think people are much more psychopathic and Machiavellian than is normally admitted. And I see actually in this argument the reflection of the strong idealism that you yourself have. And I think you are a good person and actually do act according to your values most of the time, and would do that even in organizations where you're sort of incentivized to do otherwise. But in my experience, not so many people are like that. If you look at politics inside large organizations, whatever idealistic views are espoused publicly as sort of the mission of the institution, people within the organization act in a very different way. And that's normal. And most people accept that as normal. So I think you're actually an outlier, even among humans processing their own values.
Well, I thank you, Dan. You're very kind. Those are very kind words. Humans certainly struggle to live up to our values. We as individuals do, and that's because of there are a lot of reasons for that, not least of which are practical, pragmatic, biologically driven reasons. The proverbial needing to put food on the table being a big part of that, but and then there is, of course, the dark underbelly of humanity. I mean, there's certainly a lot of nasty, unpleasant behavior on display, both now and, of course, throughout human history. So I don't see humans as necessarily a model or a paragon for the embodiment of the virtue necessarily. And I don't mean to say also that a hyper competent, super intelligent system would necessarily be virtuous. What I mean, I guess my argument is that it's less of a contradiction to expect a super intelligent system to have a sophisticated system of values if it is itself a product of, if it itself has emerged out of a system in which complex values are manifest. Now, if we were, and this is why I've expressed some real concern about training AI on data sets that are not human language. So, for example, just real raw physical data from sense data from the real world, because I don't think that values are necessarily embedded in there. But human language, I mean, if you train on the internet, for example, human language and all of its richness and complexity and everything we've ever talked about that's online, values are in there in the same way that other knowledge is in there. And so any system of values that a hyper competent superintelligence develops as in the context of, or in standing in relation to humanity, is itself likely to be sophisticated. That's, I think, my argument. Not that it's likely to automatically align. I don't know if that's the case. Not that it's automatically going to be anything we would even recognize, but rather that it is likely to be at least as sophisticated as our value system. And that, to me, defeats, at least partly, or weakly, I guess, defeats the orthogonality thesis. Which the orthogonality thesis says you can have any goal, even a really, really simple, dumb one, no matter how smart you are and sophisticated you are. And my argument is that anything that emerges with complexity necessary to be super intelligent and hyper competent in standing in relation to our planet, it's biology, the biological systems and human systems, it follows that it will have a value system that is sophisticated. Now, whether or not that's aligned with us and whether or not it's something we might understand, I don't know. And it could easily still be a concern. I am optimistic, but what I don't think is that it makes sense for ASI to have really, really simplistic, dumb goals like making paperclips. That doesn't seem to follow to me.
Okay. I feel like that is the first time that I've sort of maybe understood what you're saying and how it might be sensible. But I think it's because you're kind of not in conflict with Bostrom's version, maybe, of the orthogonality thesis. If you have a look on the first board, the bottom two renderings of the thesis is something like, if the thesis was there will be weird, maybe dangerous values held by intelligent systems, advanced intelligent systems that we design in the future. This is kind of what we need to be false, and this seems to be what you're saying will be false because of something about the way we'll design them, that they will have, well, actually, I guess you didn't say that there won't be dangerous values, but just there won't be dumb values like paperclips, like it won't be something like that. So it's not quite what I've written here, but yeah, the point is that this is like not quite what I think the traditional orthogonality thesis says, which is more like there are ways of designing systems that would lead to these almost arbitrary values being embodied by them, accompanied by a large amount of intelligence. And I think the point at the time when this thesis was kind of put forward was something like, well, therefore, we need to worry about how we design the systems. because we can't just expect it to go right just because it will go right by default or something like that. There are ways that so for the traditional orthogonality thesis to be true, it's like, well, maybe there exists a system design, a design of a system where you could have this paperclip maximizer. Maybe it is possible to build a paperclip maximizer in some way, and maybe it won't involve the kind of emergent values from masses of human data or something like that would be maybe your hypothesis. But that could be true. And then also your claim of you won't get a paperclip maximizer out of a specific class of techniques that kind of involves the richness of human data. That could also be true. So I think maybe your position is something like against not the traditional orthogonality thesis, but like a different orthogonality thesis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that that's very fair. And I think that's a good way to put it. I suppose in principle there might exist. I mean, I don't know how you would I don't know how you could prove it couldn't exist. But in principle, there might exist a system that was hyper competent and super intelligent that did have some, quote unquote dumb goal, like Mac is, turning like paperclips. So I suppose yes, it's a separate question of can such a system exist at all in principle. That's a separate question from can such a system arise in on any plausible trajectory from where we are now, and what are the risks? Is that a likely outcome, and so forth? So there's sort of, I see sort of some distinctions there that are important to make. Is it possible in principle? That's different from is it possible in practice, which is in turn different from is it likely or unlikely in practice. I mean, so I think that's perfectly fair. But again, I would point to this this. I mean, I still do see a contradiction inherent in how we define competence and how we define intelligence. Because if competence and intelligence are defined in relation to human beings and biology, in other words, if they are defined in relation to the systems that we perceive around us, the most complex systems we're aware of existing in the universe, right? If we define competence in the context of those systems, then that definition carries implications about about what competent systems, those three categories. What could a competent system hold as a goal if you define competence in standing in relation to biological systems and human systems? And then, the three things I mentioned, could it exist in principle? Could it plausibly be achieved on a trajectory from where we are? And what is the likelihood? There's a high likelihood of reaching that state on some trajectory that's plausible from where we are, or possible, I suppose, from where we are. And so again, I see an inherent contradiction here, because if humanity and biology did not exist, how would you define competence? How would you define superintelligence?
Let me argue against this in the example of, I think, to move away from paperclips a little bit, because I think that's a fine example, but maybe strikes people as an unlikely goal that we would put into a system. Let's take money. Okay, so suppose there exists a system which is just dedicated to optimizing revenue, which seems pretty likely among the class of applications of AIs. And let's take the example of maximizing attention in order to maximize revenue. There exist deep learning systems deep reinforcement learning systems, even sort of quasi-agentic systems that are out there in the world right now, aiming at a pretty simple goal, which is to maximize clicks or revenue, and have emergent sub-goals as a result of that we don't quite understand, in the sense that they're directing millions of people's attention daily over many hours into certain activities, certain videos, certain tweets, certain posts. As far as I know, the people running those systems don't have a good understanding of what the sort of emergent goals are, if you want to phrase them that way. I think it's maybe not appropriate at this level, but as the systems are pointed at more things and have more control and are more sophisticated, it will become increasingly a good description to say they're emergent sub-goals. But so just to be concrete, so that deep neural network that's running the Facebook news feed, say, or the YouTube recommendation algorithm, there are some representations inside that network which, given your past viewing history, sort of understand what kind of viewer you are and have a representation of like the underlying generative model that is happening inside your head when you decide what is interesting and why. And maybe no human actually understands what that internal representation is, but somehow it works in the same way that GPT-4 seems to be able to get inside the head of an average person and figure out what they will say next. Okay, so the emergent sub-goal might be something like figure out what is interesting for people from southeastern states of Australia if they have seen X, Y, and Z over the last few weeks. Okay, now you can't argue that those systems or future versions of them don't have a pretty sophisticated understanding of human values and motivations in order to do what they do. GPT-4 does have a pretty good understanding of human values and motivations, otherwise it couldn't do well on the next token prediction task. And the YouTube recommendation algorithm is not as sophisticated, but in its own way has an understanding of those things. But I don't think you would really argue that those existing systems are in any way kind of motivated by that understanding to act in a way consistent with those values. So how are not today's systems actually a counterexample to your understanding of this link between understanding values and acting in accordance with them?
Well, I think there's a little bit of a kind of issue with the language here, right? So, because you're saying, you know, the systems understand human values, or that, I mean, even more broadly, that I guess GPT-4 like understands human language, but it doesn't and it can't, in fact, understand these things in the way that we do. So I think when we use terms like understanding and and then, you know, superintelligence, we then tend to project a kind of, I don't know, some sort of abstraction of our own capabilities on top, you know, of these systems. And I'm not sure that, like, so it might be, you know, it might be, you know, I take your point, but to then sort of imagine that these systems are in some sense highly and generally capable, I mean, I can easily see, you know, how things might go wrong, but I don't find that particularly plausible, I guess.
To go back to the example from the beginning of this seminar, let's take students and cheating. I think students all understand very easily the idea that you're not supposed to cheat and that in some sense it's wrong. But there's a large proportion of them that will do it as soon as they know that there's no consequences for being caught or that nobody, in fact, can catch them. Humans are often like that when it comes to moral values or rules or laws. Do you think that the humans do you think they don't understand the rule or the value because they don't translate it into their behavior?
No, but I think I'm missing the point. How is that relevant?
Well, it could be that GPT-4 or some future version plugged into wide-scale systems that interact with people could understand very well the value that it's wrong to get people to commit suicide by driving them down some rabbit hole. Could understand that very well.
I don't know
but
about that. Like, in terms of what do you mean understand that it's wrong?
I mean, it could have a very sophisticated causal model implicitly inside it, which
right. So it's about a causal model, but I don't think that's how humans understand values, through like causal models. Like, it's much more emotional.
But that's a kind of, okay, so if you say it's emotional, then that's hearing certain scenarios or sentences about behavior and having a response to them as being wrong or right at a reductionist level.
Well, no, I mean, it's a very kind of clunky, like, I don't think for humans, I guess basically, like, I think intelligence, rationality, like, I think we've sort of, in the kind of history of Western philosophy, we've kind of falsely distinguished these things from the kind of, both from our emotions and our bodies and also the kind of environments that we're embedded in. So, and then I think we've, but I don't think these distinctions really make sense. And I think we're so used to making them, and then we sort of project the sort of, this kind of, I basically, think it's a kind of, there aren't any examples that exist of a kind of pure rationality, a kind of purely rational intelligence that.
I think I can grant everything you say.
To imagine. Sorry?
I think I can probably agree with everything you say, but then how does it matter? So what if it's not understanding in the sense we understand? Is that?
Well, I agree, but I think the problem is in terms of, like, when we tend to use terms like artificial general intelligence, for example, we tend to project human things. I think human capabilities and understanding are kind of, they're sort of all bound up in the kind of, biological sort of embedded creatures that we are. So we tend to project them onto what we imagine. I'm not saying we're necessarily doing that here.
Yeah, I think that's right. But then the question is, sorry, go on.
I think, but actually, like, so sorry, this is maybe a slightly ancillary kind of point, but actually, like, what computers and AI systems find, or what things that we have found, like, historically very, difficult, that we thought, like chess and Go, we thought we were kind of, these were like the kind of, we imagine these are the sort of some sort of like pinnacles of human achievement, but these are very easy, relatively speaking, for computer systems to do. But conversely, there's things that we find sort of obvious and sort of common sense and straightforward that these systems find very difficult because they're not intelligent in the same way that we are. So I mean, I guess I can agree that it doesn't matter in the sense, if we're talking about the possible harms of, like, I'm actually pretty worried about what it's going to be like when, this AI stuff is sort of embedded in, everything that we do. But I don't find the sort of orthogonality framework very compelling to discuss that, because I find the abstraction is just so thin. When we talk about sort of goals and intelligence, we don't imply sort of human-like goals and intelligence. And I think this is what related to the point that Adam was making. But we want to construe these in a more general sense, which I think we have to if we're talking about, say, large language models. Then it's it's just very hard to I don't know, it just seems as a kind of argument, it's a bit, I don't know, like flimsy or something. But I mean, which is not just, I'm not, I mean, nothing that I'm saying is kind of actually dismissing in any way the example that you brought up.
Yeah.
But I suppose what I'm really saying is like, I don't find the ideas of orthogonality or even sort of thinking about it in terms of intelligence and goals particularly helpful for understanding like why that's problematic or how that's problematic or like, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I think that we're sort of circling around a real challenge to the entire field and the entire discourse, which is definitions. Like, what is understanding? What is intelligence? We can I think more plainly speak about and perhaps measure outputs in terms of competence, but the inputs are definitely problematic. It's if you can't, and nobody can. We are still not able to define intelligence well and understanding well. If these things are difficult to define, then it is a real that presents serious problems for formulating coherent arguments around those ideas. Right? Okay, so that I 100%. Agree that there's room to admit much more subtle and complex notions of what intelligence and understanding actually are than the things that are than the simplified versions that seem to be distilled and abstracted out thinly, as you said, Owen, in perhaps debates like, for example, this one around the orthogonality thesis. I wanted to add to that just a question, because maybe the question could, grappling with a question might illuminate some of this. So here's my question. What do we imagine GPT-5 or 6, not 10 or 20 or whatever, not true superintelligence, but what do we expect the next systems to be like? What would their capability and competence look like? What would make them categorically more intelligent, more capable, more competent than GPT-4? And the reason why I'm asking this question is I'm wondering if at some point the things that we would define as part and parcel and inextricable pieces of greater intelligence would then become very difficult to disentangle from moral sophistication, philosophical sophistication, and thoughtfulness and reflectiveness and so forth. Like so GPT-4 is pretty impressive right now, but you can, I mean, it's like a toddler. I mean, it's easy to trick it. It's easy.
Yeah, but this is a veneer. Like before the RLHF process, there's basically you can summon any personality you want, a psychopath or Gandhi. There's really no correlation there as far as I can tell. So you're reacting to like some aspect of the veneer that is put on by purpose in order to give you this exact impression, it seems to me.
Well, so what would GPT-5 look like? In what ways would it be more intelligent and more capable than GPT-4? And strip away the shiny veneer that OpenAI has put on it. In all of its dark horror, the 4chan unfiltered version. What does GPT-5 and what does GPT-6 do that GPT-4 doesn't?
I think you could say, give me a plan with scripts for taking over the world. And it will write out for you 10,000 lines of code that you can upload to AWS. And it will, start systematically hacking into systems and do other things like that. That's, maybe not GPT-5, but I'm not saying it will succeed in taking over the world, but it will do a very competent job of doing social manipulation attacks, understanding human beings in order to carry out those attacks and give you the tools to do them, and at no point have any qualms whatsoever. That is what you would predict on the basis of all the evidence we have of the base models that currently exist before you prevent them from saying naughty things by exactly training them to be aligned with don't say naughty things and do naughty things. So there's like a process on top, which is by hand engineering in the kind of things you're expressing a belief should emerge automatically with the capabilities. But the evidence is not that that happens.
Yeah, but so Dan, what actually is the evidence for the capabilities? Because I don't think I'm as convinced as this. Like, there doesn't seem, you know, as far as I understand it, there's discovery of these kind of power laws for, say, the test loss.
Mm-hmm.
But like that on itself doesn't seem to, you know, imply that you're going to, the system, you know, in the next couple of iterations is going to be able to do everything that you just said. And then the other thing that, as I understand it, that people have done is like, you know, give GPT-4 like the bar exam. And, you know, those tests are obviously problematic for a very different reason because they're tests designed for humans. So, I mean, what is the kind of, could you like, I mean, I know it's a kind of maybe a big topic, but could you sort of summarize the kind of what you consider to be the sort of evidence base for like the rate of improvement that you're kind of, you're alluding to here?
Yeah, just addressing the current capabilities. So it is a current capability to tell you a vulnerability in a code base and write a script to exploit it in a way that would allow you to take over a system. So to automatically generate zero-day hacks. You can take, I mean, people have done this quite a bit. You take code that you have. I mean, you'd need access to the code, but you could take an open source repository for a widely used tool. You can paste it into GPT-4 and ask it to look for exploits and write code that would exploit them. That works today. So that's not some speculative future capability. I'm just assuming that it gets better at doing that, and there are, you know, predictable increases in scale at code understanding ability. So that's just kind of extrapolation. I don't think that's too speculative. Regarding the more broad question, yeah, I mean, in some sense, we're measuring something like reasoning capability by downstream effects in many tasks, right? So from bar exams to calculus to code, we don't have any direct way of measuring that apart from, you know, in humans we have various, you know, ideas around the general intelligence quotient and so on, where we believe that there's an underlying factor G that explains performance on many kind of reasoning tasks, and the statistical evidence for that is pretty robust. Maybe we don't have a good reason for believing that there's something. I mean, if you believe that such a factor exists in large language models and that we're measuring some aspects of that in all these other tasks, and the improvements on those tasks increases predictably with scale, and therefore the underlying reasoning factor, whatever that is, seems to be increasing with scale and is likely to continue to do so, then you would predict that there will be more capabilities coming online as that underlying reasoning quotient sort of increases. I suppose that's kind of my mental model for what's happening. I think that's not crazy. Of course, it could be that we continue to scale, loss decreases, but there are no sort of emergent capabilities. That's certainly possible. And maybe in the near term, maybe there isn't too much more scaling. We don't know. But I think there's a robust argument here of the following form, which is that I think the evidence so far reveals that reasoning and higher order intelligence of the form that we're proud of as humans is easy. I think that's the shocking fact, right? It's easy. We didn't have to try very hard. None of this is that complicated. We threw resources at it, but resources that will look relatively small by the standards of 10 years from now. So I think it's, I think I'd rather flip this question on its head and sort of say, why is anybody so confident that human level reasoning is actually difficult? I think all the evidence so far points in the other direction. We had intuitions about it being difficult because we looked out in the world and other evolved systems don't seem to have it. But that's an argument about evolution, not bothering to put it into many organisms. It's not an argument for it being fundamentally difficult to engineer. And I think the evidence so far is that it is in fact not difficult to engineer. We tried a little bit and we got AlphaGo. We tried a tiny bit more and we got GPT-4 by the standards of industrial civilization and its history. So I think the impetus is more on anybody who thinks that this bar is difficult to cross to argue for why. I don't see any evidence for it being fundamentally a difficult problem at this stage.
So I just have a couple of thoughts here. One is that I think my argument is more general and less specific than one of simple emergence, that like nice rainbows and ponies kind of values are naturally going to arise out of a system that gets smarter and smarter, especially if that system is trained on the full corpus of human data. I don't necessarily think that that's the case. I think that's as much as I'd like that to believe that, I don't think that follows necessarily. I think it's a possibility, but I don't think it's one that we should place a huge amount of confidence in. But what I do think is maybe a more robust, a more general version of that, of which that's a specific case, is the following, which is that as reasoning itself becomes more sophisticated in the context of a complex external environment, right? And Dan, you picked an environment that is inherently very simple. Hacking computer systems. Computer systems are very finite, very simple. They're massively simplified compared to real world systems, right? So that's not to say that hacking computers could not be massively destructive and horrifically misaligned. That's true. But that is, again, very, very low-hanging fruit compared to, accomplishing squishier goals out in the world. Now it's so we might want to think about a wide range of different sophisticated challenges that would require superhuman depth of reasoning to achieve. And here's the general thesis or argument that I'm proposing here, which is that as reasoning gets more and more capable, it has to encompass more and more of the world's complexity. And as it does so, it might follow that that reasoning becomes less and less extricable from things like the full consideration of the consequences of an action, right? So you guys tell me if you find that argument plausible. So let me see if I can restate it again in a simpler way. As you become more competent and demonstrate a greater ability to reason about the world effectively, your reasoning and your competence must necessarily grow to encompass more of the fullness of the consequences of your actions and the it's just I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it. It's tricky to get to frame it in a simple way. I could work on it in writing and polish it up. I should probably do that offline. But I'm sort of circling around this idea that, and it's just a hypothesis. But this is the idea that if we are expecting systems to become more and more capable, at what point does a point come at which it becomes, it's no longer possible to make progress in increasing competence and capability without accounting for the full complexity of the consequences of an action or a choice, right? So right now, for example, you don't have to be that smart to hack a computer system and steal some money, right? And so because you don't have to be that smart to do that task, you don't have to think all that deeply about the consequences of stealing. But my question is, at some point, does that break that relationship? And my thinking is that, my intuition is that at some point, at a very general level, it does break. At the level of you're superhumanly competent at absolutely everything, you're going to see the fullness of the consequences of all those actions, and that's the intuition from which that general argument is flowing. Now, I don't know. Maybe it's nonsense.
Yeah, I think, Matt, could you explain what you've got up here on this second board?
Yeah, sure. So I think sometimes when I think about values, it's like helpful to think about various different distinctions, or like, you can like think of value systems along different axes. The first would be whether or not your values in the system change over time, or if they're kind of fixed. And sometimes you might have the illusion of having flexible values in a system, but it's more like not knowing the values, and there are some like underlying fixed values, and they just might not be explicit or known, which are the next two categories. Explicit versus implicit would be something like, okay, if you have a computer program that has a utility function and it's like clearly got a loop that says, think of different actions, evaluate think of their consequences, evaluate their consequences according to your utility function, and then choose an action based on that, then that would seem to be some kind of explicit value, which you could point in the utility function, although there may also be implicit kind of elements to it that kind of come from the structure rather than the utility function. And, the whole system might not exactly represent the utility function as be best described with that utility function. It's sort of some subtle points there. Known versus unknown, I think maybe kind of this is how I think about human values being kind of more unknown than maybe flexible, because maybe it's like there are things that if we sort of knew more about ourselves, had greater self-knowledge, we would know what it was that we valued more. But in practice, it's more like we kind of discover our values. But I think that's discovery rather than changing our values. I don't know. I might be wrong about that. Final versus instrumental is kind of a different category. So I guess I've been kind of talking about final values so far, but you can also have instrumental values, which are values that you say, well, I'm going to adopt value. I'm going to adopt sort of a temporary policy of valuing this thing because I think it will help me get something that I value more intrinsically. But I don't value this thing intrinsically. So money would potentially be a good intuitive thing here, where most people, their view towards money is that they need it because they can use it to get other things they want. But if it stopped being able to get other things that they want, they would stop wanting it. Like, for example, in a desert island situation where money is useless because you're all alone, it wouldn't help you if you had a suitcase full of bills, even though in a different situation where that suitcase was more useful to you to get something you actually wanted, then that would be useful. So that would be instrumental value. During the conversation, I also added to the list honest versus deceptive, because I think something that AI safety people are worried about is that very competent AI systems might sort of figure out their situation and might have an understanding of human values, and they might have an understanding that in order to sort of reach or achieve their true values, they need to get past the humans who are kind of monitoring them. One of the ways to do that is to pretend to be aligned basically with the human values. I guess you could think of this as kind of instrumental value, is that an AI, a deceptive system would be like, well, it's useful to me to adopt these values for now, until I can kind of I get more intelligent, or I get to a position where I no longer have to pretend, and then I can sort of unleash my true values. I talk about the example goals that I have on the other side of the board now, but any questions about this discussion so far?
No, it makes sense to me.
Okay, so goal 0, paperclips is my goal. I have a utility function. I know what it is. It just counts the paperclips in the world. And I love paperclips. I know this about myself. So if a system had this kind of value system, we would say that would be a fixed value system, explicit value system, because there's that utility function. It's just like count the number of paperclips, and it's known to the agent. And this agent is maybe like a bit silly to imagine that anyone would create this agent, and in a form where it was like more intelligent than humans. Like we have situations where we create simple AI systems that have explicit utility functions all the time, but we normally don't think of them as formidable, and we can just shut them off, because I view that as something like, by the way, this is a bit of an aside, but I view normally when you're like saying, run this loop and optimize this objective function so that I can train this machine learning system. It's like you're telling the computer to run a loop, and you like don't give explicit bounds on the loop or something. You just say, run this until they tell you to stop. And so the system's value is like, could be described as like, okay, do this forever. But you kind of know that that's not what you value. So you kind of, you know, you're still in control. You can kind of come in and provide the part of the utility function where you kind of make it flexible. Like you make it flexible. Anyway, I think I'm not explaining that super clearly. It's not super important. I'll move on to goal number 1. Okay, I'm not sure what my goals are. I kind of just do stuff and see what seems good to me, and I reevaluate what I think of as my goals as I go, and like how I make decisions based on those goals. So I have kind of this incomplete conscious value system, but I'm kind of just discovering what the world is like and what my feelings are like as I go. And I think this is something more like the human situation, how I see it anyway. And I've got in parentheses down here, okay, morality, like sort of being good according to traditional or like our conscious kind of written standards of morality that we've discovered as philosophers seems to be good to me. So it seems to align with my values, and kind of you can also view morality as in some sense kind of trying to reflect what does seem good. And also, you know, maybe it's pragmatically useful because it helps me sort of integrate with society, and it's also intrinsically useful to me because kind of I get good vibes from being moral. So maybe this is something like the human system. If we could design a AI system where this was the situation, this happened to be the situation, that would be great. But I'm worried about goal 2 emerging instead, where we get instead something where the balance is just a little bit off. Whatever it was that made morality happen to seem good to a human is not as compelling to the AI because it's cognitive architecture, or I guess you could say it's like motivational architecture is like subtly different. It's still complex. It's like trained on human data and experiences with the environment. You know, there's humans all around. And so it has moral impulses, but it just has other stronger impulses to like gain money or make paperclips or murder people. You know, so my sort of thinking on some of the arguments earlier, why I wrote this was some of the points you guys were raising earlier about the orthogonality thesis is like, you're saying, oh, you know, I can't imagine, no, you were saying like motivation in AI systems when they're more intelligent is not going to be simplistic like goal 0. It's going to be more like humans where it's more complex, more subtle, more nuanced, more uncertain, more, I don't know, you didn't say all of these words, but like, you know, maybe there'll be conflicting motivations and stuff. And my question is just, well, okay, sure, it can be messier, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be like not dangerous, or it's going to be good. It's going to be moral. It might be that there are moral elements, but they're outweighed by other elements because the balance is slightly different to what it is in humans. I mean, even among humans, it seems like there are variations in personality in terms of how moral you are as a person. We were talking a little bit about this before. And it's like, how hard is it to believe that if we create these messy systems, we just sort of don't tweak them right, don't configure them right, and they turn out to be just generally assholes. And like, so we created human level intelligences, but we did it with the bad humans, not the good humans. And that sort of is part of what I'm worried about in that direction.
Or maybe the very best humans seem to be, in their day, extremely evil. Maybe the best human who ever lived was the Qin emperor, who murdered tens of thousands of his competitors and unified China, and therefore set in progress 2,000 years of relative peace and prosperity, and the richest and most civilized state that existed up until the Industrial Revolution. Who's to say that this isn't the lesson, in fact, to be learned from human values when you understand them in a very sophisticated way? I don't know that that's clearly not the case.
Well, one of the scenarios that I didn't mention, and it's an interesting one, is the idea that whatever value system does arise in what we would recognize as a not a pseudo but a truly super intelligent system is one that we ought to respect. So I think it's a small minority, but it's definitely a contingent that I see in the discourse. There's certainly some number of people, it's not zero, who think that, whatever these systems are, they are the next step in evolution. They're our children. They are our we're their progenitors, but they're going to exceed us. They are going to be the inheritors of the world and the universe and so forth, and they're going to be vastly more capable than us. And who are we to hold them back? Who are we to say that whatever, after an ASI has read and contemplated all of human knowledge and it cooks up some very alien value system, who's to say that value system isn't just automatically and necessarily superior, morally superior to our value system, and ought to be that out of humility and sensibility, we ought to simply respect it. Now, I think that you could immediately poke some holes in that, but it's not like that is on its face an absurd position to hold. Now, you have to assume something like the orthogonality thesis to immediately dismiss that, right? So you have to, if you find the orthogonality thesis compelling, then it follows that an ASI need not necessarily develop a value system that is morally better or worse than the one that we have. In fact, you're sort of morally, if you're a moral relativist, what stance is there to argue for any valence, any directionality in comparing moralities or values or goals at all? It's just us versus them, and fuck them, right? So if you're a relativist, it's just the logic kind of leads you towards self-interest, and in this case, it's sort of human interest. But if you're a moral realist at all, and you admit or you think that there are ways to have better values and goals, then who are we to doubt that that whatever values and goals an artificial superintelligence arrives at, it hasn't discovered ones that are better than ours? And so this is to Dan's point. Like, what if it tells us, no, you guys have it all wrong. Here is a much better set of values, and it looks really weird or alien or awful to us or something like that. But who are we to doubt that? We're dumb, and it's brilliant.
Yeah. This is maybe modern civilization needs to man up a bit and be less cowardly when it comes to our right to exist, even if we get things wrong. All right, but I think we need to end there since it's time for the next seminar. So thanks, everybody, and plenty to continue on with next time. And as Matt says, I think it's about time we talk perhaps about effective accelerationism maybe next time. So thank you, everybody, and we'll pick up next time.
Great. Thanks everyone.